Hola, hola. This is your boy Tico Trend, aka Eternal Sadist. And this podcast slash live stream is going to be about black people in this modern day. It's going to have various clips and, my commentary on it for the most part. The neat thing about black people in this modern age is they were the easiest to trick because of black women. By tricking black women, you can destroy the black community for the most part. Especially if the best way to actually describe it and put it into context is the inner city, basically. The inner city is predominantly ran by women for the most part. Well, pretty much is ran by women. So the neat thing about it, it's not shocking to me to see that the outcome to their labors, their children, ends up growing up to be, you know, going through the criminal justice system and the shit along the lines of that. The sad part about that is if black women would have never stepped into the inner city, they wouldn't be in the problems that they're in now. So they have nobody to blame but themselves. And the sad part about that is here's how what you know when they have no one to blame but themselves when they have shit like you know generations of welfare queens for the most part who are on welfare for generations to come. Mom was on welfare, daughter on welfare, granddaughter on welfare, great granddaughter on welfare. Basically, it's like a generation after generation, a generation of welfare recipients for the most part. And the sad part about that is the outcome to a lot of those women tend to be men who, especially when it comes to the men, it tends to be men who end up not really doing very much with their lives, or ends up being men who make it, but they like somehow, some way go bankrupt in the future because they spend so much money because they're not used to managing money properly, and they just buy it and get it and buy it and get it because they're not used to having money, which is sad. So like they get money, they blow money, and now they don't have money, and now they're talking about bankruptcy later down the line. The sad part about it, a lot of the people who do that, like rappers and basketball players and people like that, they basically tend to try to keep it quiet as much as humanly possible, so everybody think they're still stunting and shit like that for the most part, when in fact they're really not. Um, but I'm gonna share some pictures, basically, of neighborhoods back in the day that were, where people lived even during slavery, and like during the racism, where they lived side by side with each other for the most part. First one coming up right about now. This, my friends, is Black Wall Street. Not Black Wall Street. I'm sorry. 5 Points. I was talking about 5 Points, basically with all the the gangs in New York. Before the gangs in New York was even took place, it was basically a nice hodgepodge of black people. Don't get it twisted. These black people aren't fighting; they're actually dancing. Um, right here in the cut, right here, they're actually dancing. Um, and that seems to be like one of the many things. I wonder if I can make this bigger. I'll make it bigger. What the hell? But yeah, basically, it was a hodgepodge of people, and the sad part about that, it wasn't as poor of a neighborhood as everybody made it out to be, especially even during the gangs in New York era. It wasn't as poor as everybody made it out to be. It was actually a nice working, um, a nice in between middle and lower class neighborhood, basically. At this time, it was actually a hodgepodge of different people from different groups. But even during like the gangs in New York with the whole entire gang thing that Hollywood pretty much sensationalized, it was actually a working class neighborhood, a decent working class neighborhood with people who actually had some things and they had like a decent education and shit like that. So it wasn't as poor as everybody made it out to be. During this time, as you can see, a lot of the black people are dressed very nicely, and some of the white people are dressed very nicely, and some of the white people are dressed not so nicely. But it basically there was a lot of interbreeding and not a lot of intermixing basically that went on in this neighborhood before the black people eventually got pushed out, and there was hardly any black people left in the neighborhood, and they just turned into a bunch of white people. But even during the time with the white people, it wasn't as the schools wasn't as good as it was when it was like majority black people, but it was like the Irish, the Germans, and a few other groups, Italians, basically a few other groups basically lived in that neighborhood. But the schools was decent. The school was still decent, but it wasn't as good as it was when the various groups of black people lived there. Let it be the upper class, middle class, lower class black people lived there. It wasn't the same for the most part. This is Black Wall Street. Basically, it was a wealthy black neighborhood. Um, it was burned down to the ground. Basically, the bodies were stacked up in the streets and burned basically like it was wood, like a fire, like it was a bonfire. Basically, some of the bodies were stacked and burned, and some of them were thrown in the waters in the woods, and disposed of in the woods, the waters, and like nearby forest, basically, which is really really sad. It was a very wealthy black neighborhood. They had banks, they had post office, they had schools, they had everything. There was about 10,000 black people that lived there. The money circulated in the neighborhood between 36 to 100 times. So it was definitely it was a black neighborhood that pretty much, supported itself by, keeping all the money within the neighborhood. And the sad part about that, irony to that is that was higher than a lot of the other groups of people. That number is actually higher than a lot of the other groups of people in the United States on keep when they say, well, circulated through the neighborhood this many times. This is either higher or just equal to the amount of numbers that it actually the money circulated in the neighborhood before it left, which is actually pretty funny. Um, but yeah, it gets down here to the bottom if you read it basically about its destruction for the most part. It says unfortunately Greenwood's fame did not originate from its success as the center of the black wealth. Instead, its its fame came after the destruction in 1921. The KKK led one of the most brutal attacks ever recorded in history, leaving 306 I mean 300 dead and over 9,000 residents homeless. Let that shit sink in. So, over 300 residents are dead. There was 10,000 residents that lived in Black Wall Street. So that means about like 900 of them are unaccounted for, give or take ish. So either there's more dead or there's a bunch more homeless. I mean, or or there's that many homeless, or there's that many dead and much more homeless basically when they burn down the city, which really sucks. And it's just stuff like that. Here it goes. They're basically here goes a. It was ransacked by a mob of. It was ransacked by a mob and of irritated and envious whites. The bodies were basically stacked in the streets and never buried, never properly buried, basically. Um, but in addition to the body count, in addition to the body count, 1,256 residents and 1,256 residents and 150 thriving businesses were burned into the ground, including 21 restaurants, 30 grocery stores, 2 movie theaters, a hospital, and the city is basically never rebuilt. They basically burned it down to the ground. They destroyed it for the most part. Here's another shocking thing about Black Wall Street. Um, Jackson Ward was home to the first bank chartered chartered by an African American woman in the United States. Let that shit sink in. An African American woman founded the bank and chartered the bank basically. But it was chartered by an African American woman, so like she got, which was actually really really nice. The irony to it is Jackson Ward was not destroyed conveniently, so they kept the bank there and they destroyed everybody else. Many residents eventually abandoned, leading areas leading to the swift financial decline, basically. A third Black Wall Street neighborhood. There was a third Black Wall Street neighborhood, so there's a second one too, but they don't talk about the second one. They talk about the third one. It was the community was led by 2 prominent black businessmen. Um, John Merrick and Charles Spalding, basically. Unlike Black Wall Street, the parish street district benefited from the cooperative relationships with the whites. So yeah, basically they had it basically benefited from the cooperation of white people, basically for the most part. So at that point, they actually did work and do business and have white people basically. So the second one is not in here anywhere, I believe. I could be wrong. I might have overread it, but yeah, that's pretty much sad when you actually got to go through that shit and you know you don't learn your history. And, that's the McGraw Hill history books for you in America. That's basically how it works. Um, I've always found that interesting for the most part. Shit like that. Um, there's various things where we're talking about public housing and stuff like that, and you know, African Americans, and people always downing African Americans when in fact you got various people on these pages saying how African Americans ain't shit and won't be shit and shit like that, and you got some people saying how African Americans were like very very good and they were the last vestige of hope in America, while all the other communities were falling to all this feminism and other great shit for the most part. Um, so it's a mixed bag on this page of shit. Um, that whole entire Abraham Lincoln thing, basically during the Civil War, and during his presidency, for the most part, he wasn't an abolitionist, but he was a Republican. But he was an abolitionist. But the South thought he was an abolitionist, so therefore, that's why was it South Carolina? I think it was either North Carolina or South Carolina decided to secede from the Union, basically because of that, because they thought he was an abolitionist. Meanwhile, he wasn't. Um, it's just facts. It is what it is. So yeah, it's one of those things that everybody talks about. Got to play devil's advocate to both sides. Um, and there's this lovely thing here that I wanted everybody to see when it comes to Central Park. The sad part about Seneca, I was talking about Seneca on one of my live streams. It was a very decently, somewhat robust middle upper class neighborhood, because the sad part about that is nearby Greenwich, the nearby Greenwich, New York neighborhood, basically is known as for rich and upper class. Basically, the stuff that they had here was just as valuable, if not more valuable, than the stuff that the rich people in Greenwich actually had for the most part. When they dug up like pottery, they dug up old bowls and plates and shit like that for the most part. Before they basically excavated it to basically try to basically they basically excavated for some archaeological digs basically to find all this stuff that was buried under Central Park where Seneca actually existed. They actually found that they actually had schools and 3 churches and their own little thing going on there. And it was about like a little over like 600 odd people who lived in Seneca. They had like Seneca, then they had like a nearby version of Seneca that had like a couple different like white people sporadically mixed throughout there basically that were immigrants and stuff like that were actually doing very well. And they lived side by side basically, and some actually lived in Seneca. Some lived in Seneca, but most of them lived by the neighboring town that they kind of sort of referred to as like in a neighborhood basically known as Seneca. They were just plot owners basically, and they owned land there and they had houses for the most part. But yeah, it was like Seneca, definitely check it out. It's basically Seneca was basically where Central Park is. A certain portion of Central Park, I think, was like 12th. What's it? 104th? I can't remember. But yeah, it's actually in this video right here for the most part. If you want to find out where it actually sat at in the park, basically, what blocks it sat at for the most part. And it was a very lovely, bustling town. They had a very good school. They had very good education system. They had all this other great shit for the most part before the government decided that they wanted to take it from under everybody. And matter of fact, I'll just play this video. Matter of fact, I ain't got no problem with that because they basically like there's a certain portion of it where this is basically the documentation of how many slaves lived in New York at the time, basically. And I got to actually stop it every now and again to actually comment on this so I won't get in trouble for, anything crazy, basically, even though I'm using it as a learning experience for the most part. So I got to stop it and pause it every now and again, sadly. You hear that? Basically, slavery wasn't abolished all at once in New York and various other states and various other parts of the various other country cities and various other parts of the country for the most part. Most cities, like New York, it took like 30 years apparently to abolish slavery. So that's the number of slaves that they had from one time to another, basically, and it basically diminished over a 30-year period. Even though it was supposed to diminish right away, that it pretty much diminished in over a 30-year period for the most part. And I think it was a little more than 30 years that it actually took to actually get rid of all the slaves. And the same goes for various other states and shit like that for the most part. And that's one thing that I love about it because because the McGraw-Hill books will have you believe that, well, technically, technically, slavery was abolished, so it was over. No, it wasn't over. They actually had to actually take the necessary steps to actually abolish it, which took more than what the books in your history class basically tell you for the most part, which really sucks once you think about it. And it's sad. It's very, very fucking sad. But That's typically how that works for the most part. They make it sound like it's this great thing that just ended completely out of nowhere when in fact this shit took years. And the sad part about that, during this time, before that time, when the whole entire Jim Crow thing was going on, there was the indoctrination. During that 30-year period, there was a shit ton of indoctrination to black people to put them in a situation and predicament that they're in today. Sad part about that is black people can unteach yourself this shit, but they enjoy being, a lot of them enjoy being the stereotypes that they are today, which is very sad. But let's let it continue. This is the beginnings of Seneca, basically. This is the beginnings. This is pretty much the beginnings of Seneca. Black people started buying land because that's the only way you can be considered free. Apparently, in the United States, you have to own some land, basically. Okay, yeah, I was wrong. It was 82nd and 89th, 82nd and 89th, I think she said. Yeah, 82nd. Yeah, 82nd and 89th Street, where the community of Seneca basically happened for the most part. But then on top of that, they'll tell you that there was more stuff that actually sprouted up around it, like where like immigrants moved to, and they commingled with Seneca and stuff like that. They did business with Seneca, and the people in Seneca, they'll tell you all this stuff eventually. I'm sorry, I said free. I meant to say vote. But yeah, you can only vote. You can only vote if you own property, basically, and that was the only way you can vote as a black person if you own property. Despite the fact that you were free, and they had passed all these other, laws and bills that the right giving black people the right to vote in America, you actually were only allowed to vote in various places if you own land. So they put a stipulation on your ability to vote, which is very very sad. And the sad part about that is even through the 1800s into the 1900s, basically, black people were still impeded from voting, while white women were actually able to vote like freely in the early 1900s for the most part. White women were able to vote freely, but black people were still impeded from voting, even during like the civil rights era. Oh, they used to like bar black people. They used to have like a line of cops blocking black people from the voting polls. They used to have like various things that used to block people from the various voting polls, or they'll turn black people away saying they're closed, or they'll make up various reasons on why they can't vote today, basically, or they'll say, "Well, you missed it. It was yesterday," or "It's tomorrow," or something like that, basically. And then when tomorrow rolls around, when they come back and they come to vote, it's closed. That's typically how they treated black people in those days, even during the voting era. So technically, black people really didn't have the right to vote, and there's always stipulations on them voting. And if they didn't meet the stipulations, or if there wasn't stipulations, they were always barred or blocked or impeded from voting for the most part during this time. Yeah, so basically, people, the elite people that could travel, basically, you know, got jealous of other countries and decided that we want something like France or we want something like, you know, other countries in Europe, basically, in our little area to basically, lessen the load of their neighborhood to actually make it so more people can't really move in or people can't take up residence, basically. And this is where the Central Park thing actually came into play, basically. A bunch of elitists basically kicked all these people out of their homes, basically, and you'll start to see like the newspaper ads to make them less than or paint them in a negative light to basically make them seem like they ain't shit. Basically, you'll see this now. See what happened there? They gave away land that didn't belong to them, that belonged to other people, and you'll see how they actually got around it. They basically said they were squatters. They said all this other great stuff, and they basically ripped the land from under both the Germans, the Irish, and all these black people that lived there way before the German and Irish people. And the sad part about that is they're showing you this so they can actually. This is basically how they painted it so they can make it sound like you know they're living in squalor and they're living in shanties. Basically, this was actually the post picture after they destroyed the house and they kicked out a German family from the house. I think it was an Irish family or a German family that lived in his house. And they kicked them out and they basically tried to paint it in a way to say that they lived in squalor and this, that, and the other. And this is basically how they lived. Now, if you actually see this picture, if you're a white elitist or if you was anybody else that didn't live there, you would think literally this is how they lived. But in fact, it's going to go into detail on how they actually lived pretty soon here. See, call them squatters. Squatters Village is what they refer to it as. This is how media gets people right here. This is how modern media basically this is pretty much where modern media gets its shit from, basically. They refer to everybody. They said there were whites, Negroes, and Indians that lived there. It says they were mongrel dogs. Mongrel dog were pretty much that whites, Negroes, and Indians lived there. Mongrel dogs roamed everywhere for the most part. If you don't know what a mongrel dog is, that's pretty much a diseased dog or a rabid dog, basically, or a dog that's full of diseases that hasn't really been taken care of vet wise for the most part. So they're basically making it out to be worse than what it really is. They also said there were tails and packs of hungry of hungry hungry curs and attacking chickens. What? Anyways, yeah, they just made up a lot of shit. Uh, they and other pigs and livestock and fat boiling and they basically came up with all this shit. Basically, use of they basically said garbage from the cities was unfiltrated and this, that, and the other. Meanwhile, they actually had like good working water and shit like that. They had like nice plumbing system in this town. They basically just made up a lot of shit. It's then they also called it no man's land. See, they said basically Seneca Village was wealthier than what most people assume, basically. And they're about to compare it with the nearby Greenwich Village. Greenwich is a Greenwich Village or Greenwich area, basically. So, like, so where the elitists lived in Greenwich, basically, they're going to compare it with those people, and you're going to find out that not only did they have stuff on par with them, but they had stuff better than them in their houses for the most part, which is actually pretty funny. But they said but before this popped up, they basically referred to it as a no man's land, was what they had highlighted in the one area, basically, no man's land. Even though there's people that live there that actually were good working people and very educated people for the most part. You hear that? Toothbrushes weren't calming in America for the middle class and working class people in America. So basically, you had to be upper middle class or higher before 1920s to basically own a toothbrush. A toothbrush. It kind of takes me back to like when people talk about like a lot of the old heads talk about they used to drive around in the car with no seatbelts. Basically, having a seatbelt in cars way back when used to be a luxury. That was actually a luxury feature in your car to have a seatbelt. Most of the other cars didn't have seatbelts in them for the most part until they actually made it a law for all cars to have a seatbelt, or it started becoming a standard for all cars to have seatbelts for the most part. But back in the day, a seatbelt was a luxury. Like, think about that shit now. Like, back when I was growing up, seatbelts were luxuries. Now, see, and this is back before. This is back when nowadays you know kids barely, like, African American kids barely graduate from high school. Barely had graduate from high school at a decent rank. But back in these days, it was one of them things where, like, you're graduating from high school. It doesn't matter. And a lot of these people went on to go to college. A lot of these people went on to do other careers or trades and stuff like that for the most part. So they did practice continuous education. Let it be a trade. Let it be on the job training. Let it be, a college, stuff like that for the most part. But again, McGraw Hill books won't tell you this shit. That slur that's blocked out said nigger, basically. Nigger village, basically, is what it would refer to it, despite the fact that there were some German and Irish people living there. They referred to it as Central Park. The limits of the Central Park lies mentioned known as nigger village, basically. So Seneca Village was referred to as nigger village by the elites, the white elites. Let that shit sink in. Despite the fact that there was like Germans and Irish living there, like I said. The Eben inhabitants. Nigger Village. Nigger Village, the Eben inhabitants, after whom the village is called. They refer to it as Nigger Village, and then they try to clean it up and say Eben, as in ebony. Inhabitants, basically, whom the village is called, which is actually pretty funny. So they basically, destroyed. They basically, this is basically the court of public opinion, basically, at play, even in the 1800s for the most part. Look, the white elites get to play now. Yay! We got our own park, like the ones in France and England. Yay! Pretty much, that's what it is. What it was. Yeah, keyword temporarily. Temporarily. That means it's coming down whenever they can get rid of it or whenever they get around to actually taking it down, basically, because you know how fast the city works. So typically that's going to be taken down very soon, which is very sad. And I'm about to cut this. Yeah, and the sad part about that is it wasn't just in Seneca that these neighborhoods actually existed. It actually showed Black Wall Street, which was like bankers and people like that in that one, very wealthy people's it's bankers that lived in that one, which is actually very sad. And like this was a replica. This city was replicated many times, along with Rosewood was a more predominant was pretty much a predominant it was a black neighborhood that was like a rural neighborhood that was actually would be considered a middle class rural neighborhood where they actually had a decent school too. I didn't pull that one up for the time because I don't want to go into that for the most part. Um, this one you'll love this one. This is basically the Devil's Punch Bowl. Something I always talk about the encampments where I said there was like three of them there. People only think there was like one, but it was like three encampments here basically, known as the Devil's Punch Bowl. So I'm gonna play this one. Hear that, y'all? Union troops. Union troops. Union troops. Got to play devil's advocate here too. See? Jealousy, envy. They refer to it as an internment camp. That's something that you would normally hear from Nazi Germany. Just saying. Just saying. How fucked up is that? How hood is that? And they say that black people are savages. They provided them with They provided all of them with shovels to bury their own relatives. They just gave them shovels and told them to dig and bury their own damn relatives, basically. In an encampment. Listen to that. Bury them where they dropped. Let that shit sink in. See that picture? How that little boy's sitting? That's property. That is property. If you sit like that between somebody's legs, you're basically the property of that person. That's pretty much where the whole entire thing, where you see the black women in modern day, they'll braid their daughter's hair or they'll braid their child's hair, and they sit just like that. That lets you know that that's property. That's where that comes from. That they're property. That's how, if you ever notice, if you've ever been to a black woman's house and you ever seen it, see them braid hair, like they'll be sitting on a couch and their child will be sitting right there on the floor or the ground, really basically on the ground, right beneath them, right between their legs, just like that. That's the demonstration that is my property for the most part. And listen to what they said. Literally, I already said this stuff. I literally said this already, but listen what they said when they after they. Can you imagine begging to go back to a plantation and be slaves again? Think about that shit. You're willing to go. You're willing to go anywhere but where you are now because this is worse than the plantation that you were on. Getting whipped, getting you know beaten, getting buck broken and shit like that for the most part, and all this other great shit. This was worse than that. Let that shit sink in. The sad part about that is there's been acts of this actually happening that where people act on behest of the government, on behalf of the government, basically, and do atrocious things to human beings in the United States for the most part. This happens all the fucking time. This happens so often it's fucking ridiculous. Again, here we go. See, a sign of property. That's basically what that is. That's pretty much the gesture of property. That's my property. Look at that shit. Property. That's that his position and that kid's position. He's letting you know that this is his property. Damn, he went there. Nazi concentration camps. Damn, similarities. You want to know the funny thing about Nazi Germany that everybody leaves out in the McGraw Hill history books? There was about a little over 100 people that lived in Germany at the time when the Nazis were rounding up Jewish people. The funny thing about that is they leave that out because the Nazis actually killed every single last one of those black people and just rounded up the Jewish people. Because the funny thing about that is the Nazis actually seen those black people who lived there as a bigger threat than the Jewish people. So they didn't even afford them the chance to live or go work or go to Auschwitz or go to any of the internment camps that they had set up because they were that scared of them that they literally just annihilated all 100 and odd black people that lived in Germany. I think it was like 100 odd minimum that lived in Germany. They just killed them all. They were afraid of them, so they killed them all. So they didn't even afford them the right to at least work in an internment camp and or go to the get trained into like the internment camp to possibly go into like the gas chambers and the smoke in the furnaces for the most part. They just killed them all on spot, basically on site. They basically on sighted all the black people. Basically, when the Nazi Germany rolled in, they seen black people. They pretty much killed them on site. It's kind of like that. The saying on site. Yeah, basically that's what they did on site. That's one thing right there. this is this is a this is a this is something that I had to actually go investigate. I even had my daughters go investigate it too. Um, the sad part of this is Lyndon B. Johnson for the most part. Um, the neat thing about this, I've always heard a lot of MiGTOW say that he actually said this bottom one, when in fact him actually saying the bottom one wasn't true. He actually said the top one, but he didn't say the bottom one. They basically use the top one to legitimize the bottom one for the most part. Could he have possibly said it? Yeah, there's quite a chance that he possibly said it, but nobody's ever corroborated this second one. But they have corroborated this multiple times. This top one, the second one where he says, "I'll have these niggers voting Democrat for the next 200 years." That is basically a lie. That they basically use the first one to basically, because they always use, when they say that one, they usually use it in tandem with the top one. And the top one basically reads, hang on. These Negroes, they're getting uppity. They're getting pretty uppity these days. Listen to that. Yeah, so basically he did say Negroes for the most part. He did use niggers. He did use nigger when he would call the Senate, and he was referring to was it third for to somebody that he appointed to thing. He basically said, and I quote, "I want everybody to know I want everybody to know that he's a nigger, and that I elected a nigger to the Supreme Court for the most part, and I want everybody to know he's a nigger." Basically, literally what he said to the Senate at the time, basically when he actually appointed I forget who he appointed. I think it was like Thurwood, I think his name was, basically that one black guy. That's what he referred to him as for the most part. But yeah, he did say the first one. The first one was corroborated along with other things where he actually said that nigger. He said nigger and in confidential, basically. He did use the N word basically, and he did refer to black people as niggers and shit like that for the most part. And he did not mix his words for the most part. But this second one that a lot of the MiGTOWs keep on requoting over and over again is actually false. He actually never said it. Could he have said it? Yeah, but nobody's ever corroborated it. They corroborated the first one. They've corroborated this one right here, but they've never once corroborated the second one at all. They corroborated corroborated the first one. They corroborated them actually talking to Congress on the Senate and Congress on the phone, calling that the one Supreme Court guy that he basically elected a nigger. They've actually corroborated him saying niggers and talking about black people as niggers in private conversation, but they've never actually corroborated any of the other shit for the most part. Like this, they never corroborated this shit. This shit is bullshit, basically. Could he have said it? Yeah, he could have said it, but he didn't say it. This is basically something that got bought up and added to this. It got basically every single time you hear this, it's usually in tandem with this, so they can try to legitimize this. When in fact, this has actually never been corroborated. Nobody's ever actually said that he actually said it. Meanwhile, he's actually said the first one. Yeah, basically we got to give him a little something, just enough to quiet him down, not enough to make a difference, basically. So that's his personal belief on black people for the most part. Basically, yeah, pull back up their uppityness. Basically, he basically called them uppityness, basically because they were actually starting to do things and make moves and shit like that, and a lot of the other black people that they were against were starting to make moves and shit like that, and you know, got to give them a little something, just enough to quiet them down. Basically, is basically how we refer to them. That's what it says at the end of that, for the most part, which is actually pretty funny. But yeah, that's generally how he actually believed about. That's generally what he actually believed about black people, generally. And by the way, Lyndon Johnson was actually Democrat, by the way. Yeah. So black people caught it from all sides for the most part. This is talking about the massacre, the Black Wall Street massacre for the most part. I've already actually did the little thing for the little story about it, but we might as well just run into this one too while we're at it. The hell. Like she said, you won't find it in most history books because McGraw Hill, as I always say, the McGraw Hill history books. I tell you, they always leave shit out. They always leave some shit out. Now I hate Vox, but they actually did a really really good job on this one. I'm not a fan of Vox at all, but they did a really really good job of this shit. Sadly, they actually did their homework. This Indian lady's always on point for some odd reason. I don't know why she's always on point for all this shit. But anytime they send her in for some shit, she always get the shit done, and she's always well researched, and she always does what she need to do to complete her job for the most part. Some of these other people that they got on their staff, they questionable, but this Indian woman's always on point with her shit for the most part. She does her research. She actually goes in and she actually does what she needs to do basically to get shit done basically, and bring the truth to light. These niggas is dressed to the nines. This is back when niggas actually, was doing shit with their lives back in the day. Now you find majority of the niggas in the hood running around thinking that they're doing some shit when in fact they're doing nothing more than being slaves to the US government, basically. You're basically gonna be what happens with that, what I mean by that is you're slaves to the US government, meaning that you're gonna get arrested, you're gonna be in a system, and you're gonna be making license plates or doing any odd in jobs basically. Because the sad part about that is slavery is abolished, but it's not abolished if you commit a crime and you go to jail because now you have to work in jail basically for very little to no money basically to actually atone for your crimes basically. So jail was where jail was where slavery basically stops at for the most part. I mean, don't get me wrong, you get your three hots in a cod, and you might get cable TV, which is better than most people living in America, but at the end of the day, you still got to work or still got to work it off. Some people don't have to work it off, but some people do. But a large majority of the people end up working in jail some damn where, and they get. Oh yeah, FYI, they stop letting you get degrees in jail. By the way, them niggas look tight. Them niggas made me look like I was middle class in high school and shit. no, no, I'm just joking. I say actually dress. I used to dress something like that, but modern though for the most part. I used to always look fresh to death in high school for the most part, and that's the funny thing. But I was more modern than they were though for the most part. I'm just joking about it because, in other words, the modern version of that now isn't as dapper as what I'm the modern version of what that would be now isn't as dapper as they used to be back in the day. In other words, is what I'm trying to say. Some niggas was like GQ, straight GQ. Hear that? Hear that? Just mobbing people, straight mobbing people, and it wasn't even a fucking mafia. They can't even blame it on the Italian mafia. It was just random white people that just was envious and jealous that just was straight going in on niggas basically. See, this is this is public opinion working his magic back in the early 1900s and 1800s, basically. Court of public opinion right here. So women always had the court of public opinion at their side, despite the fact that she didn't really want to press charges. So that lets you know that nothing really happened for the most part. But there was a call to action anyway, because white knights. Oh, which is actually pretty funny, because at one point there was actually a white supremacy group actually referred to the white knights or something like that, or the sons of the white knights of something like that. I don't know, but yeah, basically there was a yeah, white knights basically. Interesting. Shot their way through, and it wasn't even a fucking mafia. That's funny. Running the niggers out of town. I mean, running the niggas out of Tulsa. Mm. Don't you just love that? That was actually printed. That was actually a picture that was actually done and printed in the paper, by the way. Just FYI. Funny, isn't it? Yeah. 35 blocks. That's worse than what's going on in Minnesota. Um, 35 blocks. That's fucking devastating. 35 blocks being burned. Can you imagine 35 blocks being burned today? Let's just think of it like this. Can you imagine 35 blocks being burned in Minnesota? Or even 35 blocks? I mean, Minneapolis? Or even 35 blocks in Minneapolis? Between Minneapolis and St. Paul's? I think there might be, but either way, can you imagine 35 blocks of that city being burned right now? That would be fucking devastating. Do you know how many stores would be destroyed? Do you know how many houses would be destroyed? Do you know how much shit would be devastated because we live so densely populated and densely packed together? Do you know how much devastation that would be if 35 blocks, 35 blocks, 35 to 37 blocks were literally destroyed? Think about that shit. That would be utterly, that's utter annihilation. That's utter obliteration, basically, at that point. There's like no coming back from that shit. You hear that? Court of public opinion. Only white people died. Despite the fact, yeah, basically only white people died. They basically got to paint it that way. So they can make it sound like the black people were big and strong and they were so dangerous and stuff like that. And it's basically a nice way to spin what happened to make it so that they make it seem like it was okay for the most part. They make it seem like that was okay and it was actually a necessity that needed to happen, that two white people died, basically. Because at that time, two white people were more valuable than a bunch of black people for the most part. Like it was way better. It was way better than the whole entire Muslim woman thing for the most part. There's like two Muslim women, or like for the word of like one Muslim man, basically. He was like, if you were black, basically, it's like it don't matter how many black people come to your rescue, you would never be equal to a white man, basically. And two white men are basically are priceless, more priceless than hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of black people, basically back in his day, despite the fact that black men during slavery were 10 white men, basically, when it comes to doing work. Just throwing that out there. Had to add that in there. Black men were considered 10 white men or more during slavery. That's the amount of work that they actually did. See? See? They even had 10 cities after they burned down their shit. And this is where the beginning of the end, where a lot of the black women actually started moving towards or actually started, thinking that it was great to move towards, the inner city with the white women, basically. I mean, despite the fact that this happened before the whole entire thing, or, urban redevelopment for the most part, where white women were moving into the city, happened. This happened about this same time too, for the most part. But living like this, would you rather live like this if you're a woman because of hypergamy, or would you rather live in the inner city with the white women, basically, because of hypergamy? So typically, this is basically how they lived for a good period of time before they eventually dispersed, which is sad. And the sad part about that is they started rebuilding the city, but it never got it never got fully rebuilt due to like various reasons. Let it be zoning, let it be, reasonings, let it be, not giving them the proper, stamp of approval to do so, to it being destroyed again, or just various things, basically. It was a postcard, see? Postcard. And like they said, there was already a cover up after that even happened, basically. Obviously they deserved to die because two white men died, basically. So they all deserve to die. Oh my God. Basically, is what it was. White supremacist culture, basically burning Wall Street. Postcards were part of white supremacist culture. And they basically had on the postcards running niggas out of Tulsa, basically. Let that shit sink in. On the postcard, running niggas out of Tulsa was literally on that postcard. But I digress. Yeah, they basically erased what really happened, basically, in Tulsa. They referred to it as a race riot, when in fact it was actually a massacre. It wasn't a riot, it was a massacre, basically. Only rioting was the white people showing up in the neighborhood with guns, basically, and the black people, standing on the other side of the tracks, trying to defend their little heaven called home, basically. Or the little heaven, their home called heaven, their lovely homes that they refer to as heaven to them, basically, I should say, or vice versa, no matter how you think about it. They've been rewriting history for a very, very long time. History either goes to the victors or the losers. Good example of that is Paul Revere. He didn't ride that far. He actually got arrested. But we still sing the song "The Midnight Ride" of Paul Revere, despite the fact that he got arrested and he didn't make it that far. Yeah, let that shit sink in. And we always talk about the history goes to the victors, but we sing about losers quite often in history. But I digress again. How this nigga looking like a cross between a pimp called Slickback and Al Sharpton, or a pimp called Slickback and what Fisk, the Kingpin and shit like that. Check this nigga out. Look, straight up, look. This nigga. But I digress. 300 is putting him out. He's actually a descendant of the people who actually lived there. Sadly. Um, there's only 2 official victims from that in that cemetery, which lets you know that there's a lot of missing bodies out there everywhere. Because like they said, they tossed them in the water, they tossed them in the woods somewhere, they tossed them every damn where, but where they needed to be tossed, basically. Because basically black people are garbage. Wait. When you put together a commission, we know who's at the head of this commission. That lady's in charge of the commission, and that guy's in charge of the commission. And it's these black people so they can legitimize the commission. That's basically how it works. That's basically like the NAACP. They needed to pull in this random black woman to basically make it so it's an actual thing for the most part. Make it more believable, or they could sell it for the most part. Because the NAACP was actually started by white people, and they just pulled this random black woman in basically to basically legitimize the NAACP. That's basically how it really worked. The same thing that goes for this commission. These 2 are in charge of the commission, and these 4 were basically bought in to legitimize the commission. They set her house on fire, went right straight to the curtains and set her house on fire. Nice. That lady passed away a while ago. It sucks, but she passed away. Yeah. See, they had trucks loaded with victims of the rats, so their bodies went anywhere and everywhere, basically, but where they needed to be, buried properly in a cemetery. You see how that works? When it's niggas, it's not worth investigating. Now, if it was some white people, or if it was a white woman, we would break out the backhoes and dig. If it was white women, in this day and age, if it was white women, if it was a white woman that happened to, it could be one white woman. We would dig up the shed, we would dig up store, we would dig up under that car right there. We would tear that whole entire bridge down to find this white woman's body, basically. It's kind of like what we did with the 2 Asian women that actually got captured in North Korea, basically, because they didn't know that they were sneaking across the DMZ zone. I mean, you can literally see the DMZ zone from like damn near the Hubble space station, and I'm still trying to figure out how them bitches didn't know. With dug-ins and tanks and armed people, you didn't know you were sneaking across the DMZ. Yeah, that just blows my mind. But we move heaven and earth to get them out, though. We actually made a couple trade deals. We actually gave the North Koreans a couple nukes. Just to get them 2 Asian women out for being stupid for the most part. But I digress. Waste of money. It's over. It's done with. Let the past be the past. That's pretty much how people paint that shit for the most part. Let the past be the past, unless it's somebody of interest to them. If the people look like them, if the people looked like them, if the people who passed away were to look like them or look like the majority or be of the majority, there'd be a totally different sentiment. They would dig up shit. They would be like, look what we found. We found this, that, and the other, and this, that, and the other, and it used to be this, that, and the other, and this used to be this, this, and this. If it benefited them, they would dig it up, basically. Mm-hmm. True story. But yeah, let the past be the past. I'm willing to bet you he's a Democrat, and I'm willing to bet you that he is, yeah, he's a Democrat, and he's willing to reopen it. And he's probably a leftist Democrat. He's probably one of them leftist social justice warrior type motherfuckers, basically. But I'm judging him based on looking at him. Let's find out what he got to say. He kind of was using some leftist. He was more professional about it, but he was kind of using some leftist SJW terms, basically. But I'm going to say he's left, and I'm going to say he's a Democrat, and he's probably looking to be reelected, and he's probably looking to kiss some ass so he can actually be reelected again for the most part. But basically, yeah, I basically played that one so I could see like half the shit for the most part, where they just dump bodies any fucking where. They ain't give a damn where they dump the motherfuckers at. But yeah, that's typically how that worked. And yeah, but it's just stuff like that just, now in the modern day stuff, they make you believe a certain thing. And they basically the thing about it, because everybody always says, this, that, and the other, and this, that, and the other. Well, black people need to do this, and what people forget to realize is the whole entire psychological damage that went into this whole entire thing, the whole entire psychological thing that went into actually making black people the way they are today, for the most part. Because the sad part about that is, if it wasn't for this indoctrination and this psychological stick that they went through, they wouldn't be in the mess that they're in. And because the funny thing about that is, you'll hear people in the manosphere say, well, they should do this and they should do that, and they shouldn't be acting like this and they shouldn't be acting like that. But then they'll use the indoctrination for women or indoctrination for Disney, but they'll leave black people out of the indoctrination, basically, which I've noticed. And the sad part about that is, they were indoctrinated, if not worse, if not just as bad, if not worse than the Disney indoctrination that y'all talk of, basically, because this is like 500 years of this shit of indoctrination. And the sad part about that, it drug all the way into the early 1900s. And the sad part about that, it not only did it drag into the early 1900s, it drug into the mid 1900s. And the sad part about that is, like, people will say, well, y'all should let the past be the past. The mid 1900s, my dad, my mom are still alive. My grandma is still alive. And she actually was a part of this shit for the most part. And the sad part about that is, I'm only once removed from the generation who actually were treated like this. Because, like, at the end of the day, my mom had to go through this shit. My dad had to go through this shit. My aunts and uncles had to go through this shit. So no matter how much you say forget the past, my mom and uncles, aunts, grandmas, and everybody on the branch above me basically had to go through this shit for the most part. So I'm only one generation removed from all this bullshit that took place in America for the most part. So forgetting the history, when in fact my mom lived it, my grandmother lived it, and well, my mom passed away, but my grandmother's still alive. So she remembers this shit. She remembers how she was treated. She remembers how her dad and mom were treated. Hell, she remembers how her grandparents were treated for the most part. And that's the sad hard reality. Like, you can't say they should just do this now when in fact there's years of psychological damage that's done to these people. There's years of psychological damage done to these people. We've already found out and done studies on, blue eyes, brown eyes, basically, and where they did with the blue-eyed people, they were superior, and the brown-eyed people, they were inferior, basically. Then they flopped the roles. You see what psychological damage does to people in a matter of like minutes or hours, for the most part. People start really thinking that they're this for the most part when they start believing this, so they perform poorly. And the sad part about that, when the blue eyes were superiors, they actually believed that they treated the brown eyed people like they weren't shit for the most part, and the brown eyed people just failed on their tests for the most part, and they were getting subpar grades and shit like that. Then when they flopped the roles, the people with the blue eyes actually started failing at the shit, and the people with the brown eyes started thinking they were superior, and they started treating the people with the blue eyes like inferior people for the most part. So studies like this has been done. So it actually works. It works very quickly, and that's sad. And another good example of that was the prisoner guard experiment. Basically, they actually had to stop that one because it got the fuck out of hand for the most part. It got way the fuck out of hand. They actually had to pull the plug on it. That's how bad it was. And the sad part about this is what people don't realize is like I'm not for the reparation thing, but I am for, if you're going to do anything, I would say psychiatry or psychologists need to just come in and like just address this shit. Like, pay for some psychologists to come in to basically right the wrong of the history for the most part. Other countries, they've actually came out, apologized, given written statements and shit like that. Shit along the lines of that for the most part. They've actually came out and done shit like that for the most part. But like, America's the only country that hasn't really, came to terms with its past. We just sweep it under the rug. We have this saying, let the past be the past for the most part. But the sad part about that, every other country has came to terms with their past. Every other country has came to terms with their past. Hell, even Africa right now, despite the fact that they're just treating white people like shit, basically. But you also have to take consideration too, those same white people that moved in are descendants of the people who did them wrong. I don't agree with what they're doing, but at the end of the day, it's one of those things, if the shoe was on the other foot type thing, or those things where like white people used to fear back in the day with black people in the United States, that they might rise up and, take over the lands if they have too many of them here for the most part. Africa, there's a lot of black people there and not enough white people there. So they're actually experiencing that whole entire thing that white families feared in the South, basically, with black people outnumbering the white people for the most part and rising up for the most part. And that's typically how that works. But yeah, the sad part about it, at the end of the day, black people today are basically slaves of the system. Like I said, they're already explained the prison industrial complex to, like, all the black people that are indoctrinated into being like working worker bees or worker drones, basically, and just working at these low menial jobs for the most part, like, McDonald's and, places like that for the rest of their fucking lives. Hell, majority of the fucking nurses' aides are African Americans for the most part, or African Americans for the most, black people for the most part. And the sad part about that is they're taking care of people that white people don't even want to take care of, that they don't even want to take care of themselves, so they just drop them off somewhere else, basically. And the funny thing about that is, in a lot of Latin American countries, your grandmother lives with you for the most part, and we take care of your family until the end. And the sad part about that, in America, that's a luxury to be able to slap your grandparents or your parents in a retirement home for the most part. And that's one of the many things that I've actually found crazy and funny. being in America, where you literally do shit like that and you pretty much put your pass because you don't feel like it or you don't want to. Technically, you just pass the care of your mother or your father off on, or your grandmother off on other people for the most part to do it for you, and then you pay for it to be done for the most part. That's typically how that works. You basically put them in a nursing home. You pay other people to do it for you every month. Basically, they pay your parents got to pay a monthly fee, but you pay their monthly fee from their dues for the most part to make it work for the most part, which is sad. Whatever their retirement was, you basically are paying their retirement to the nursing home for the most part. And they worked hard to do this, and they actually basically bought you up, probably put your ass through school and shit like that. And this is the thanks that you give your parents and your grandparents. Yeah, that's pretty sad. That's very sad. And it's just shit like this that just makes it so, like, black people nowadays are literally slaves to the system for the most part. Let it be the whole entire black culture that black people love and cherish so damn much, which is owned by like Jewish and white people, whites and Jewish people basically, to like that whole entire rap thing is basically owned by white people and Jewish people for the most part. So like you don't even know your own fucking culture that you refer to as your culture. This is my culture. It's actually not your culture. It's actually the music business, which is actually owned by white people and Jewish people for the most part, or Jewish people and Jewish white people and Jewish people and just white people in general. And it's sad, but it is what it is. Like you own nothing. Your culture is like manufactured for the most part. And white people are making money off of you. And Jewish people are making money off of you too as well. And it's just stuff like that where like you're literally doing all this work with nothing to show for it, but lease cars, and you come to find out later you were actually only leasing a car. You weren't really actually buying a car, or you were leasing all these jewelry pieces, but you weren't really buying all these jewelry pieces. So you're basically stunting. You're basically stunting on layaway, basically, is what I'm saying for the most part. Instead of actually owning this stuff and actually putting the money down to actually own the shit, you're trying to stunt and make yourself sound bigger than what you really are. That is your problem. That's where you fuck up with your money. By trying to keep up with the Joneses when you shouldn't even be trying to keep up with the Joneses. You should be trying to diversify your portfolio because the rap game is not forever. Not everybody's going to be your Jay-Z's or your LL Cool J's and shit like that, or your Ice Cubes for the most part. Not everybody's going to do that. Not everybody's going to be your Dre's or your Snoop Dogg's. All these people that still rap until the day that used to rap back in the day. You're not going to be all these people. You're not going to have this longevity like a lot of people. Not everybody can have an Eminem longevity. Not everybody can have a Jay-Z longevity. Not everybody can have a Nas longevity. Not everybody can have a Jadakiss longevity. It's just facts. So you got to learn to diversify your portfolio and do more with your life and your business for the most part. Hell, 50 Cent had to learn that. And he's actually doing good. You don't really hear him in a rap song anymore, but he does have businesses and he does make money for the most part. But apparently he's filing for bankruptcy. But the question is he actually broke or not for the most part? That's still up for debate. And it's stuff like this that lets you know that you're stuck within this culture. Let it be the Jordans. Let it be the Jordans. Let it be the jewelry. Let it be the whole entire the clothing. Let it be all that shit that you hold near and dear to you that you think is like making you look good when it's actually making you look bad. And the sad part about that is all this shit is perpetuated by women, the black women in the neighborhood for the most part. You got to have the latest Jordans. You got to have this stuff. You got to have the latest jeans for the most part. Hell, these skinny boy jean fashion basically isn't really black culture. It's actually, I forget who actually started it, but it wasn't black culture basically, and it basically got passed down to black culture to try to make the black men more effeminate basically. And the sad part about that is, dude, you look gay when you're in those jeans. I hate to say it that way, but my friend Bart, who is gay, has actually called black people gay. His actual words was, "Them niggas is gay," and I actually busted out laughing because I was thinking of shit. But he said it first and actually had to laugh about it. I mean, I probably said it was wrong that he said the N-word, but dude, it was funny as hell because I was thinking of shit. And he beat me to the punch. And the sad part about that is it's funny when that actually happens, when a gay person calls these black people gay for the shit that they wear. And it's funny, like, they get mad for being called gay or looking gay when in fact, dude, if a gay guy's hitting on you, you're probably gay or you're probably doing something gay. It's just facts. Like, I'm just saying, you probably look it, act it, dressed it, Yeah, basically look it. You act very effeminate, basically. So if you get hit on by a gay guy, you probably look or act like it. It's just facts. Nothing against gay people, but like, I've I've heard a lot of gay people say this about black people and the black community with this new style of dress with the skinny boy jeans. Like, he got mad and wanted to start a fight because I just tried to talk to him. Well, it's kind of like what I say about women. If you act a certain way and dress a certain way, you garner a certain kind of attention. So if you look it and you kind of sort of act it, you act all emotional, you kind of sort of you're going to get the attention from the gay community, basically. It's just facts. So you can't be mad about being hit on based on what you wear. It's the same thing that goes for women. If you dress with a skirt halfway up your back or shorts that, your ass crack is eating, you can't be mad when you get the attention that you quote unquote don't want, because you're going to get it. The same thing goes for black men. If you dress in skinny boy jeans and you get hit on by a gay guy, you kind of sort of deserved it. You had it coming. Just saying. But I digress. Y'all have a good one. And this has been pretty much liberal blacks are the modern day slaves. Y'all be blessed. There'll probably be a part 2 to this, by the way.